Hello, and welcome to Vermont Interfaith Action's Conversations with Candidates 2020. VIA is a faith-based grassroots community organizing project made up of 59 member and affiliated congregations throughout the state. We work together as a coalition, including the Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Unitarian Universalist, Buddhist, and Muslim traditions. Our goal is to effect systemic change around issues that are identified at the grassroots level, issues that affect the families and individuals who attend our congregations and whom we reach out to in our communities. In years past, VIA has hosted events across the state in order to hear from candidates about the issues VIA leaders and clergy are concerned about. This year, we've invited the gubernatorial candidates to fill out a questionnaire and join us for a 20-minute conversation about their answers. Today, I am joined by Rebecca Holcombe of Norwich, Vermont. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So let's get to the meat and potatoes. So our first question is, many of our faith traditions are concerned with how we treat vulnerable populations in our state. For instance, those with pre-existing conditions or those who have been historically and continue to be discriminated against. How will you model respect for vulnerable populations?
Thank you for this question. And as your viewers may know, my life's work has been in public education. I've been a teacher, I've been a school principal, I've run school districts, and I was Vermont Secretary of Education for just over 4 years. And in that work, one of our top priorities was always, how do we make sure that we are using the educational opportunities our state provides to make sure that everybody has a fair chance? And that looks different for different populations. And it is increasingly important, given where we are as a moment, to hold ourselves accountable for making sure that we are truly not giving people an equal chance, but giving them an equitable chance. And by that, I mean every one of our Vermont children comes into this world full of hope and promise. But when we look at their life outcomes and their opportunities several years later, whether it's as they end preschool or as they end our K-12 system, or we look at their opportunities in state college, or if we look at their outcomes in the workforce, in housing markets, in health, what we see in every arena is disproportionate outcomes, which tells us that deeply and systemically, we have failed to guarantee equal opportunity to do well. And that's been something that's been very, very important to me all the way through my career. And so some of the things that we did at the Agency of Education that would certainly be hallmarks of my administration are, we always started by evaluating all of our programs and everything we did through the lens of equity. And that was about making sure that we actually counted, that we actually looked at what the impact of what we were doing was, to see whether our actions and our outcomes lived up to our words, because we can't fix things if we can't see them. The second thing we did is work aggressively to make sure every single person who worked in the agency had an opportunity to engage in implicit bias training and anti-racist education. And that's because the opposite of injustice is justice, and the opposite of racism is anti-racism. But you can't address that if you don't recognize it in ourselves. And as people who've grown up, been deeply steeped and marinated in racism throughout our history, we have a lot of work to do and a lot of unlearning to do to make sure that we do what is just for our kids. And the second is, the next thing to do is to make sure that we evaluate every single initiative that we did at the agency through the lens of equity. And whether it was a bill coming from the legislature, a proposal coming from the governor, or a piece of work that bubbled up from the field, to really think through what possible or likely impacts would be in terms of guaranteeing everybody had a fair chance. And one of the most important things we did was to make sure that when we were trying to figure out how to make education better for people in different Vermont communities, in particular marginalized communities, to make sure we involve them in the process of figuring out what it would look like. It's within lifetime that Vermonters were sterilizing members of our Indigenous community. It's within our lifetime that we had deeds on houses that said that houses could not be sold to Black or brown Vermonters. So these are recent acts that still have repercussions. And even when we look at policies that look neutral on their face, we can see that they've had grossly differential impacts. And so what we really tried to hold ourselves accountable to was asking the communities we serve what we needed to do to make sure that the policies that we were implementing were experienced in ways that built their agency, gave them voice in what was helpful, so that whatever we rolled out, whether it was the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act or some other state initiative, they could look at it and say that they'd had some voice in how it was developed. And the last thing that I always try to hold in my mind as I think about this, because this work is hard and it requires, as a white leader who is trying to lead a white state, it requires constantly putting myself in a position where I'm challenged to question whether I'm really doing the right thing for the communities who depend on our services the most. And I remember speaking just a couple of weeks ago with an 8th grade student in Vermont. She's a Black student in one of our public schools, who told me such a poignant story about sitting in a classroom. And she started by saying, I just want to be a child. Her name was Julia Gennari. She said, I just want to be a child, but what I feel like I always have to do is explain to people. And she talked about having to constantly name racism in her environment around her, and how that put her in a position where she always felt uncomfortable, always felt like she was making people uncomfortable. He said, just once, I wish someone who was white would stand up and say something. Because when I say it, people get uncomfortable. But when a white person stands up and says something, people listen. And they think that they're progressive. They think they're woke. And that really hit home for me. And I try to keep thinking about her when I'm talking about issues of race. Because 2 things she said were, first of all, that her life is defined by race, when what she wants to be is a child who is defined by her dreams and her hopes and her ambition. And that she doesn't have that freedom, that liberty and justice to be able to define who she is, because we keep seeing her through the lens of race. And the other is that we have created a situation where a child who's in 8th grade feels that she doesn't have a voice. And when she uses her voice, we don't hear. And that is such a terrible thing to teach a young person. So for me, the challenge, whether it's listening to the terrible things that are being said at the national level by our elected leader, whether it's confronting some of the challenges we see here in Vermont, it's to honor Julia and people like her across the state by making sure that we are standing up, and however challenging it is, as we develop the muscle and the vocabulary to do so, trying to act in ways that make it our responsibility to make our state more just and more inclusive. So those are some of the things I'll do and how I'll lead.
Thank you for that response. Another big concern during this time is the economy. Given the current uncertainties of when and if Vermonters who have lost jobs will gain them back, what creative and innovative ideas do you have to help with job creation that does not further the income inequality gap?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought this question up, because in many ways, income inequality is a problem that has been eroding hope and opportunity for many Vermonters, even before COVID-19. And if there is something that COVID-19 did, is it sort of pulled back the curtain so that for many people who could choose not to see it before, we no longer can turn away. And you may remember that back in November, there was a poll, I think it was put together by VPR, that mentioned that 40% of Vermonters were one $1,000 bill away from economic destitution. And we now know that many of them are far beyond that. This is a crisis. And it's a crisis because we know that two parents working full-time at minimum wage in many of our communities cannot earn enough to afford the housing that they need for their families. So they're deprived of that dignity. When you look at the long lines in Berlin and Burlington lining up to get food, we can see the depth of food insecurity, because the one place where families have discretion, if you will, is around their food budgets. But that's not a life with dignity. And people in Vermont need to have the dignity of knowing that they can live here, take care of their families, and earn with dignity and live with dignity. And that's not true for far too many Vermonters. How do we create opportunity? Education is one of the best opportunities. And we know that at any given time, there's between 3,000 and 5,000 young Vermonters between 18 and 21 who aren't working and aren't getting any kind of education that qualifies them for a job that would pay a good wage. They aren't engaged in their communities. They aren't in education. And so what we need to do is make sure that we are investing in Vermonters to make sure they have the opportunity they need to get the skills they need to go out and fill the jobs that we do know are here in some of our high growth, high wage sectors, whether it's healthcare, whether it's investing in our green energy transition so that we can bring dollars back that we're currently spending out of state, particularly on fossil fuels, and turn them around and reinvest in creating local green and renewable energy in Vermont communities in ways that builds wealth and builds opportunities here for people to live well and take care of their families. It's also about making sure that our college system is strong, because our Vermont college system, 80% of their students are from Vermont, and many of them are first generation in their family to go to school. It's a very powerful opportunity because it stabilizes the communities where they are, but it also is that ladder of opportunity that helps Vermonters who are growing up in every county of the state climb up into jobs that pay them good, livable wages, not just minimum wage, because that's not enough. So those are some of the kinds of things I would focus on, but there are many other ways that we can make opportunity. We know that as a state, we've been investing heavily in childcare, but at a time when we spend about 60 to 80 million more dollars on childcare every year, we also lost about a quarter of the capacity of the system in the state. We know that for a young family, and particularly in a state where something like a quarter of our children are in single parent households, we know that one of the easiest ways to make sure a family can go to work and earn and take care of their families while knowing that their children are safe is making sure that we've solved the problem of lack of affordable childcare. And that would be another way to both increase equity, because it affects women most of all, but also to make sure that people can go to work and know that their children are cared for and safe and have the opportunity to grow and learn while their parents work, if that's what they choose. So those are some of the opportunities. I know we're out of time.
Yes, thank you. And transportation can be an influencing factor on someone's job prospects and has an impact on the environment. What are your two top transportation priorities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think transportation is one of those issues that it's an opportunity to help families. We know people have the longest commutes in the nation, just about in Vermont, in part because we have a lack of affordable housing in many of our walkable downtowns. And we know that the costs of commuting are very, very burdensome on families who would love to have that cash available to meet other needs as well. And I would say that because transportation and housing are tied, not just to livability and affordability, but also to sustainability in our climate goals, we need to deal with them at the same time. And so the first thing I would do is, even though we can't afford to wait until gas costs $12 a gallon, I would embrace participation as a state in the Transportation Climate Initiative, because it's an opportunity to both look at how we further our shift off fossil fuels by addressing our dependence in transportation on fossil fuels, but also to raise the revenue we need to support that transition off of fossil fuels in a way that is equitable and just, that targets public transportation where it's possible, so that people are able to get out of their cars and into effective public transportation. It could be rural ride sharing. I was speaking to someone up in the Northeast Kingdom who was talking about the challenge of seniors who really don't have to own a car just to go 45 minutes to get their groceries and their prescriptions, but how sharing a ride share, an electric vehicle, could be a good solution. It's also about strengthening trains that are running up the west side of the state so that people can get off of Route 7 and get into train and get to work if they need to, but also make access to good housing and walkable downtowns along the way. And we'll have to also support electrification of transportation, whether it's through subsidies for families that have to commute long distances, can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. But if they could get an EV with support from the state, we would meet our carbon goals, but we would also help them save many of their costs in the long run. So those are some of the opportunities, but I think a lot of it also comes back to housing. We need to make sure there's sufficient housing near where people work so they aren't forced to travel long distances when they really would like to be near where they work and near where perhaps their children go to school.
Thank you. And our final question for you is around education. What would be your top 2 priorities in making education more inclusive and accessible for our students? How do we ensure educational equity when some students have access to high-speed internet and other students do not?
Well, you know, you really can't ask a former Secretary of Education for only 2 priorities, because this is my life's work. So, but I'll do my best. You know, I'm glad you bring up broadband. And one of the decisions I made as Vermont Secretary of Education, we made a strategic decision when we had to implement, under both state and local and federal law, a new assessment system to administer our new state test entirely online. And we're the only state that did so in the first year of implementation. And one of the reasons we did that was because it would challenge our school districts to use every available dollar, including federal dollars and federal E-rate dollars, to make sure that they had sufficiently high internet at their school to be able to support this online assessment system. And our rationale was that if we could get internet as far as a school, it was that much closer to people's homes. And I begin by saying that because we are at a point where we are going to have to use every trick, every available funding source to get this job done. In the last recession, we dumped $150 million. It was an attempt at a private sector solution, and it gave one town very, very good internet, but it left large swaths of the state without any service at all. And we know how acute it was. And we've all seen the pictures of teachers sitting outside the schools trying to get enough internet to get online to kids. I've also talked to superintendents and principals who told me that there were students that they never spoke to after schools closed down until year. When you're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds, when you have people who just drop off and out of contact, there's this huge question about whether they'll ever come back. And so we cannot afford not to have have broadband. But it's about much more than education. It's about making sure that businesses access to broadband so that they can step up. It's about making sure that healthcare can be delivered, because try taking a 95-year-old to a doctor in the middle of a COVID crisis in the winter. And I've had person after person say, this is a place where telemedicine could help. And it's also an issue with domestic violence. If you want to file for relief, it's pretty hard to do so in some parts of the state without broadband. With respect to education, I am fully committed to education. I'm very proud that by the time I left the Agency of Education, every single major state group dealing with education, whether it was the teachers, the superintendents, the principals, the curriculum directors, the special educators, had put education into their mission statements as a core priority. And that's everything I spoke about at the beginning. But it's also about how we work together, both with our early care and learning system, our children 0 to 5. The most powerful investment we can make is making sure every child gets a good, strong start. That means we need to make sure we have a high quality, affordable early care and learning system so that when children get to kindergarten, they're already healthy and ready to go. We also need to strengthen our college system so that the good work we do from age 0 through high school is just continued, and we continue to build those bridges to opportunity so that in every community, people can grow up strong and healthy and be able to participate in the economic life of their communities and also in their civic institutions. And that's what I'll commit to as your governor.
Thank you. We have 30 seconds if there's anything you would like to say.
I would just say that it has been such a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to Vermonters all over the state. When I do so, I come away so impressed and so hopeful about our future, because I see everywhere people who understand that post-COVID-19, we can't go back to where we were. need to be moving forward to a future that is more sustainable and more just. And I know as Vermonters we'll get it done. My local news interview, they said, what would you do with the superpower of invisibility? My only answer was, now is not the time to be invisible. So I'm going to invite all of your members to be sure to show up, to vote in the August primary, to please show up in November. And fortunately, you can vote by mail in November, because more than in any period in my lifetime, we need to show up and make sure that our state is truly the state that stands behind all of our people, and make sure that we're defending life, liberty, and happiness for every Vermonter, and not just those who are already doing well. So I encourage you to come and join me in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. All the best in your campaign efforts, and to our folks listening. Primary voting is, as Rebecca said, on Tuesday, August 11th. You can request your mail-in ballot today, if you haven't already, from the Secretary of State's website, or by calling your local town clerk's office. Thank you for watching.
Thank you so much.